This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and today we're going to start a segment called Lessons in Literature. And we're going to start by talking about how to simply annotate literature so that we can write about it later. So check it out. Once again, this is the Garden of English, and today we are going to begin talking about how to annotate literature. We're not neglecting the other series that I'm doing. I'm going to work on those videos later on this week as well, those underclassmen videos that talk about paragraphing and whatnot. But I also want to talk about annotating literature because I do get this question a lot from students and teachers. Is there a simple way to annotate literature that can help really build some meaning? And I think I've got some steps that we can actually take for such. And so I'm going to quickly go over those today. And just so you know, I'm going to link the beginning of Most Dangerous Game down below. So there will be a link down there for that. And I encourage you to actually just read the beginning of Most Dangerous Game because that's going to be used as my example so that it can help you understand what I do when I teach literary annotations, especially to try to simplify things so we can get into more abstract thought. We're going to continue this series, also Lessons in Literature, by looking at different literary elements and talking about how we can explore their complexity. So we'll start by dealing with setting, and that video will come out probably by the end of the week, and then we'll continue with the most common literary elements that I think that we typically see as readers. So we'll talk, each one will have its own video based on how can we look at the complexity for that. And I think that I'm going to rely pretty heavily on Most Dangerous Game as my text. So if you read it today, then you'll be able to actually know what's going on when I deal with other videos if you want to follow along. So because we are starting a new series, you are going to want to click like and subscribe so that you can follow along in the series and so that you can actually look at how we can explore all literary elements in depth. And actually what we're going to try and do is we're also going to try to see how interconnected our literary elements are, because especially in AP Lit, you don't just need to identify literary elements, you want to make sure that you can write about them in an interconnected manner that is also analytical and not just summary. So anyway, I'm going to shrink myself up like normal. We're going to just put myself right up here in the, there's wrong button there, in the top of the screen. We'll straighten myself out in just a minute before I cut my face off. And here we go. This document that I have down below is also found right in the description, okay? So you can access that document. And really what I have going on here is I have rules and steps to follow that will help you read analytically and also help you kind of try to do so in a manner that focuses on what you're reading for. Instead of just being told, hey, annotate the text and you underline words that you don't know and you put question marks or whatever. I think that if we actually try to identify literary elements and understandings from those literary elements, and that's all we annotate, that's going to produce better planning for an essay later on. It's also going to produce better thought processes as you read and hopefully ultimately maximize comprehension. So anyway, one of the things that I'm going to point out is that you'll notice that I have these broken down into two steps for how to kind of annotate a reading, and one is while reading and the other is after reading. And really what we need to get used to is that all of these sub-steps in the while reading, we kind of need to do all of these at the same time. Now this is hard, especially if you've never practiced this before. So if I'm going to do this for the first time, I'm going to actually take point A, point B, and point C as separate steps, but eventually we want to internalize them enough so that they're not separate steps and so that they just kind of happen all at the same time. It's kind of like when learning how to kick a soccer ball. My oldest son used to have to stop, turn his foot, make sure the inside of the foot hit the ball, and then he would keep running. Now, both my oldest son and my youngest son can run and kick the ball at the same time. They can know just how to turn their foot while running and maintain the control of the ball. We're doing the same thing just with literature here. So anyway, the first step that we have while reading, or the first part of what we should do while reading, is as we read, if we notice any transitions, we definitely want to divide the text into relatable sections. So if we notice that there seems to be some element of a shift, which there will be, because if you've watched my other literature video, it'll remind you that good authors give a shift, or shift happens, however you want to word it, I don't care. You're going to see many shifts, and because of that, you're just going to draw a line in the middle of the text, like, hey, I think there's a shift right here. You just draw a line right there. Now, you might want to make a little note of what you think shifts. Maybe there's a new character that's introduced. Maybe there's a new setting. Maybe there's a new conflict. Who knows what the shift might be, but drawing that line at minimum will break your text into sections, and that's great because when you have to write about this, you now know how many paragraphs you're most likely going to have to write as you break it into sections, because each section should most likely be its own paragraph or two. So that's kind of also really nice to break it into sections, because when you notice shifts, you intrinsically are looking for elements of structure, and you need to talk about structure when you write about literature well. So this helps you just recognize, oh my word, I've already thought about structure implicitly. Now I need to actually articulate that when I produce a paper. So that's all you have to do for the first part of this. You just put it into relatable sections. There's no correct answer on how to do that. If you see or notice a change for some reason, or that there's some new relationship presented, you mark that, okay? Now, when these marks happen, though, I do encourage you to mark any discourse markers that showcase that. This is especially important with poetry when you see words like but or yet or however, those kind of words that indicate contrast, because a lot of meaning in poetry stems from the contrast. Maybe it's contrasting images that are presented. You want to make sure that whenever you notice the language that shifts, and that's why you mark the shift, that you also just circle the language or images that shift, because that's going to help remind you why later when you go back to actually write about this, okay? But that's the easy part. We just mark where we think it shifts, and we mark the language that we think shows us that. Now, the harder part, right, doesn't actually show up yet, because the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to think about the literary elements that we do know. Now, please note, when I talk to my kids about literary elements, that's when I talk about lit terms: symbolism, personification, metaphor, simile, anthropomorphism, all of those sorts of things, right? Setting, dialogue, that kind of stuff. And the reason why I call those the literary elements is because elements have to be nouns, okay? But when I talk about literary techniques, I really encourage my kids to move towards verbs with literary techniques. So if they can identify a metaphor as an element, I then say, what's the technique though? They want to label it as a metaphor, and I'm like, no, they're actually contrasting, or the author's actually comparing right there. Pick the right one, because that's going to allow you to write about it better. So elements are nouns, techniques are verbs, okay? At least in my classroom, that's how I do it. And that helps kids realize what they're doing. So if they can read and annotate for literary elements, we'll talk about how when we write about those elements, we're going to turn them into techniques by articulating those elements with verbs. And we'll see that as we go through this kind of lessons in literature series that will continue for a little bit. Okay, so anyway, as they read, what's going to happen is this down the left-hand side of the page, and it is actually important that we do it down the left-hand side of the page because we want to start with the concrete. I just have kids read, and as they read, if they notice literary elements, then boom, you just mark the literary element on the left-hand side. Just make a little note of it. If it's a metaphor, you can just write MET. If it's a simile, you can write the word simile out there. If it's foreshadowing, you can just write foreshadowing there. Whatever the literary element is, that goes on the left-hand side. It's nice and concrete. If they notice it in the text, boom, they've made a mark, and then we're gonna move on eventually, okay? And you'll notice that I've actually given the literary elements that I have my kids focus on when they make their annotations. And these are the ones that I think kids are most familiar with, particularly in high school, and also the only ones that they need to focus on. All of those crazy advanced literary elements like synecdoche and metonymy and things like that, they're just not that important right now in high school, right? If you're a literary studies major, then of course let's go into the nitty-gritty. But senior year, even AP Lit in high school, I can write darn good AP essays and just darn good essays by just knowing these fundamental lit terms right here. So you're going to notice that I have plot, dialogue, setting, mood, characterization, conflict, suspense, irony, point of view, imagery, and figurative language. And underneath imagery and figurative language, I would want my kids to be as specific as possible with that. If they see a simile, I want them marking it. If they see symbolism, I want them marking it. If they see anthropomorphism, I want them marking it. If they see personification, which is different, by the way, I want them marking it. If they see foreshadowing, I want them marking it. You're going to notice in my document, I've got this little blank dot right here. That one should have been listed as anthropomorphism. But anyway, as you read down the left-hand side, this is not a hard step. So if you're trying this for the first time, or if you're teaching this for the first time, have your kids read something and just mark it for sections in the text where they think there are changes, and have them explain why they thought there were changes there. Then have them go back to the same text and say, good, down the left-hand side, look for these common literary elements, things that kids know. Now, I won't let kids just mark plot, by the way. Okay, they do have to mark what part of plot they think that they're actually experiencing at that moment, whether it be exposition, suspense and conflict, climax, or resolution. Please note, I do not call the upward part of that plot triangle rising action. I call it suspense and conflict, because what contributes to the rising action is suspense and conflict. And if kids think they're looking for action and I'm reading a story about gardening, they're not going to be getting tons of action. But when the kid runs out and checks to see if his plant is growing after 2 days after planting it, then they're going to realize that there's some suspense in that kid's life. So I think it's easier, instead of saying rising action, actually tell the kids what to look for, suspense or conflict. That also helps with climax, because if the kids realize all of the major conflicts that build throughout the story, the climax is where all of that comes together and is eventually dealt with all at once. And so if the kids can trace their conflicts and say, oh my word, all of these conflicts are here, then we can know exactly where the climax in the story is. Okay? So anyway, they're going to annotate for these elements right down the side, and I'll show you what that looks like. Now, the next thing that we hope that students will do right away is that when they see a metaphor, they try to create meaning from it. Right now, like I said, if it's the first time, just let's get them to identify the metaphor. But after they do this whole left-hand side, we want to send them down the right-hand side of the page, and we want them to just answer this question. What can I understand as a reader now that I have noticed this conflict? What can I understand as a reader now that I have seen this metaphor? And it's not just what can I understand, it's what can I understand about the story or the characters in the story. Now you're going to notice that up here in my literary elements, I do have mood, characterization, and suspense, and they're highlighted in yellow. The reason why is because these become incredibly abstract. So these are actually elements of understanding. When I notice that somebody is characterized as a jerk, it's probably a conflict that shows that. So on the left-hand side, I would actually see characterization / conflict. On the right-hand side, I would see, oh, Tybalt's a jerk. There we go. I might see characterization and conflict on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, see Tybalt is loyal. And I'm thinking about that time in Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet when Tybalt is like offended that Romeo came to the party, and he's like, oh my word, I can't stand this. I'm going to go get my sword. And his servant goes to do so, and then Capulet gets upset with him. But Tybalt's enraged, and the reason why isn't just because he's a fiery hothead who's a jerk, it's because he's so loyal to his family and his family name. We don't want kids to miss that part. And if they really look at that conflict, and I could say, how is Tybalt characterized, they can come to that understanding. And that will be the note on the other side. Tybalt's a jerk, but he's loyal. Good. And now we've got 2 quick notes. Conflict characterization, Tybalt's a jerk, but he's loyal. Boom. And that's going to help us create topic sentences later on. Quick annotations, okay? The next thing that I have the kids do is I try to have them just label in each section what they think the author is doing. That's when we start talking about lit techniques instead of lit elements, okay? And I actually encourage them to link these lit terms with powerful verbs. And you can actually see that I have that going on right here. So this is a poster that I have. We do have this for sale on my website and in our Spreadshirt site. You can access those links down below. But if they notice that there's characterization, they've got some lit techniques that they can now put in their sentences. Oh, in this position, the author, notice the template that I have right here. In this section, the author, right, if they're talking about characterization, they're going to say, oh, describes, and then whatever's going on in that particular situation, right? Or characterizes Tybalt as blah, 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 okay? And so if, let's say the kids talk about setting in relation to and they just mark the setting, they don't think about understanding yet in relation to Most Dangerous Game, which I'm going to encourage you to read once again pretty soon. I could say in this section, Cannell describes, and you'll notice that here it says setting, the word describes is right there. He describes the oppressively dark Caribbean night. Now to create a paragraph, I'm going to then have that shift to in order to, and then we'll talk about how it relates to mood and whatnot. But nonetheless, we start there with setting. Can kids talk about setting? And you'll also notice that this becomes sophisticated because the students are not actually saying setting. That might be their annotation, but that's the point. Annotations are supposed to be quick. They just write SET right there. But when they write about it, they're going to show that they know more than just setting. They're going to say what the setting is, and now we've got a more sophisticated thought about it. Okay? So that's how you actually want to kind of set up the annotating for reading. And really the annotations stop at point D, and then it becomes kind of topic sentence preparation at point E. So I really only hold my kids accountable for A through D as they annotate, and then when we plan our writing, we move on to D. And we combine, E here with the with this little template here, saying what the author is doing to create a lit technique, okay? Now, another thing that I just like to point out is that after reading, no matter what passage they get, the final annotation my students have to make is they have to make a purpose statement. This isn't rhetoric, this is literature. They have to make a universal insight statement. And the way that they do that is they look at the text that I provided to them, and I say, okay, what are some of the major ideas that this text relates to, those singular abstractions? I do have posters for those as well. However, I think that I do have a list of those attached in this document. Let's take a quick look. Yes, I do, right here. But I do have a nice colorful poster that looks kind of like these on my website as well, or in my store. But anyway, what I do is I have them identify those ideas, and then I give them a template on how to produce an insight about that stops them from just saying, in order to illustrate that, you shouldn't lie. So my template says, author writes, insert title, in order to illustrate that. And then they have to actually put a universal idea here. They can't use the word you, and they can't use the word you in any of this sentence, but they start with the idea, and they have to connect it to other ideas that the story revolves around. So if you look at my example right here on the screen, we have John Steinbeck writes Of Mice and Men in order to illustrate that companionship often requires immense sacrifice. And you're going to notice that we've got two really strong universal ideas here that book relates to, and now we've established a correlation between them. And I don't care if kids remember who George and Lenny are. I care that kids remember something about sacrifice and companionship as they get older. So when they're 30 and I see them and they're like, oh, Freitas, it's been so long, I'll be like, do you remember about Of Mice and Men? And the kids are like, all I remember is that it just reminded me throughout my life something that I've come to experience a lot, that all of my companionship and my strong companionship has required me to sacrifice more. And I'm like, oh, delicious. I love that. So nonetheless here, right, this is the final annotation that kids have to do whenever I assign them a reading. They have to actually, at the end, use this template here to create a universal insight. And now that's going to make it way easier to write about when I'm like, good, how do all of these elements that we annotated, the exposition, the conflict, the dialogue, the characterization, all of that, how do those contribute to building the story and then ultimately building this universal insight? Because this is where we want kids to get when they read literature. It's not about reading stories. It's about learning about life through stories. And that's what we do. So anyway, let's take a quick look at this right here. I have the beginning of Most Dangerous Game. Like I said, it's in our document. I'm going to encourage that you actually pause the video in just a second and read that. It's in this document right down below. So why don't you pause that right now and read it? Okay, as always, I'm assuming that you paused and actually read that. Maybe you didn't, though. That's okay. But I'm still going to just illustrate what happens here. If I read the beginning of Most Dangerous Game, what you'll notice is that I have marked here literary elements that I have now then found text for, and then I put my understanding on the right side. So this green element here is talking about setting. There's some dialogue that shows up. There's some imagery that shows up, and it helps to create a mood, okay? And now if my students really only mark setting and dialogue and they still realize that it creates an eerie mood, then we're good. I don't need them to pick out everything. If they just find that it's setting and imagery that creates an eerie mood, fine, so be it. I'm just thankful that they know the lit element, and I'm thankful that they're pulling out an understanding. And what happens here is, as they look at the setting, I then say, what can you understand about what's going on in the story because of this setting? And if they're like, it's kind of scary, I'm like, good, write that down, right? Or it's kind of mysterious, good, write that down. And the dialogue here, right, does indeed begin to make one of the characters more abrasive. And that does contribute to characterization and conflict, a little bit of setting, but we'll talk about that in the setting video, which also helps to create this kind of eerie, uncomfortable atmosphere. So then we see a conversation between two characters, and one character is completely not empathetic, which is key, because if my students can understand that this guy comes off as arrogant and non-empathetic, we have those are two really good ideas that we might be able to create a universal insight statement about: arrogance and empathy, okay? So this is written in order to illustrate that empathy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and now we can also start considering what kind of changes will we see in our dynamic characters throughout the story. But anyway, so we have a character who has some dialogue, and this dialogue characterizes him as being kind of contentious and arrogant. And if that's the understanding, that's what shows up right here. Now, I highlighted things in yellow on this side just to show that this relates to characterization, this relates to mood. So a lot of times if kids put the word mood on this side, I'll say, okay, the word mood on this side also belongs on this side. Same for characterization, because these are abstract elements, okay? So I'm thankful that they noticed that he was being characterized through the dialogue, but I want to know what that characterization is, and that comes in on the understanding side of things, okay? So as we continue, we get some more setting that's delivered through the dialogue. So notice too, what's happening here is that kids are annotating, multiple literary elements together. And this is important for kids to realize. I tell kids all the time, English is like nesting dolls, not like boxes. They want to say that English, that this is a simile, this is a metaphor, this is symbolism, this is personification. And they fit in those boxes. But it's not true. All of those are metaphors, right? Because metaphors are comparisons. So a simile is a type of metaphor. Symbolism is a type of metaphor. How do you figure out if something is symbolic? All you do is create a T-chart. What are the physical qualities of the symbol? And then what do they represent in terms of ideas? And it will match up every single time. So we have a comparison, right? And now what this does is this helps allow kids to see that it can be both dialogue and dialogue that characterizes. This can be both dialogue that also exhibits characteristics of a conflict, and now English becomes a lot like nesting dolls. They can be their own dolls, or they can be inside of one another and still be their own dolls. And that's one of the things that we want to try to get kids to realize, especially in high school, because that's part of the complexity of literature. So anyway, here's just an example of how these things play out and how the annotations would look if the kids were writing this out, left-hand side, right-hand side. And now what ends up happening is this is going to allow kids to much more easily label literary techniques if we look at the verbs, because we could say, oh, I noticed that we were talking about point of view here. That's what I noted, a shift in point of view perhaps. Well, these are the types of verbs we could pick from there. Oh, we're talking about characterization, right? Oh, what can I put there? We're talking about irony. What can I put there? Things along those lines. So that's meant to help them here. But like I said, I also have a chart for you down here that does look not only at universal ideas that you can explore with kids, and this is not a comprehensive list, but also lit verbs that you can use when talking about different elements in literature. So if this video was helpful, or if you found it helpful at all, I'm going to encourage you to actually just press like and subscribe. I'm going to make myself a little bit bigger here. Try to get that record off the screen. There we go. So I encourage you to hit like and subscribe. There are plenty of other ways, though, that you can actually support the Garden of English. You can follow us on Instagram. You can actually like us on Facebook as well and follow us on Facebook. You can also support by purchasing some Garden of English merch. We've got some really cool T-shirts. We've also got these posters right here. If you can download the files and print them yourselves, or you can get printable posters from the Spreadshirt as well. As always, these videos are free. I'm happy to make them. We're going to continue this kind of lessons in literature series throughout the rest of the week. And like I said, we're going to start by focusing on the complexity of setting next. And we'll also get into some other series that I've been working on, like the underclassmen series, and we'll continue with paragraphing. But until those come out, I hope that you all have a great rest of your school year or rest of your time as you're learning about literature. And really enjoy it, because we learn so much about each other through stories, whether they're fiction or not. Have a great one.